We are told to diversify, to hedge, to spread risk across uncorrelated assets so that when one fails, another stands. This is the bedrock logic of financial survival, repeated until it becomes invisible, until we stop asking whether the categories themselves might be the problem. The belief is that assets are stable containers, that their value persists independent of the system that prices them. What survived the great collapses of the 20th century was not what we diversified into. It was what we misunderstood about value itself. In 1923, a German pensioner discovered that his life savings, held in government bonds for 30 years, could not purchase a loaf of bread. The bonds had not disappeared. They existed, crisp and official, bearing the mark of the state. Their nominal value had even increased, but the relationship between the paper and what it could command had inverted so completely that holding them became a form of erasure. This was not a market correction. It was a reordering of what the word asset could mean. The pensioner had diversified correctly by the standards of his era. He had avoided speculation, chosen safety, followed every rule of prudent allocation. He had been destroyed not by his choices, but by his assumptions. The assets that survived were not the ones that held value. They were the ones that held attention. Consider first what went to zero, because the pattern matters more than the examples. Cash savings in hyperinflationary Weimar Germany became worthless not over years, but over weeks. A worker paid on Friday would spend the entire wage by Saturday, not from indiscipline, but from mathematical necessity. By Monday, the same bills could not buy what they had bought 3 days prior. The velocity of collapse outpaced the ability to adapt. Those who held cash were not foolish. They were simply operating inside a framework that had already been overwritten. The currency still functioned as a medium of exchange, but only in the narrowest technical sense. It moved, it transacted, it cleared, but it no longer stored. The container had cracked. Government bonds, which had promised safety for generations, evaporated alongside the currency they were denominated in. These were not speculative instruments. They were the bedrock, the thing you bought when you wanted to stop thinking about risk. And they went to zero, not because the government defaulted in any formal sense, but because the government continued to pay exactly what it had promised, in money that no longer meant what it had meant when the promise was made. The contract was honored. The value was not. This is the shape of most financial collapses. Obligations met, systems intact, value relocated. Stocks, which are supposed to represent ownership in productive enterprises, also collapsed, though the mechanism was more complex. A factory did not stop existing because the currency failed. The machines still ran, the workers still came, the products still moved. But the equity that represented a claim on that activity became untethered from the activity itself. Shareholding is a bet that the legal and monetary infrastructure will continue to enforce your claim. When that infrastructure bends, the bet does not pay out. You still own the paper. The paper no longer owns anything you can touch. In Weimar Germany, share prices rose nominally, even dramatically, but they rose slower than prices for real goods. To hold stocks was to lose purchasing power in a rising market. The chart went up. Your position went down. This is a very specific kind of trap. Bank deposits, the final pillar of middle-class safety, were obliterated, not through theft or fraud, but through the simple mathematics of inflation outpacing interest. A deposit account in 1921 that could have purchased a house could not, in 1923, purchase the nails to build one. The bank honored every withdrawal. The money was there. The future it had represented was not. Depositors had not made a mistake. They had made the correct decision inside a game whose rules had changed beneath them. What survived then was not financial. It was material. And it was not material in the sense of luxury or permanence, but in the sense of immediate utility. Farmland survived, but only if it was worked. Vacant land, held for appreciation, was nearly worthless. The value was not in the dirt, but in the crops it could yield this season, next season, the season after that. Ownership without production was a claim without leverage, but a hectare of potatoes was a fact. It fed people. It could be traded for other facts. The land did not gain value. It simply stopped losing it, which in a collapse amounts to the same thing. The farmer was not richer. He was simply less annihilated. The distinction mattered. Precious metals survived, but not in the way their advocates assume. Gold and silver retained value, not because they were eternal or because they represented some platonic ideal of wealth, but because they were portable, divisible, and recognized across borders. A German citizen holding gold could leave, could trade with someone in Switzerland or France or the Netherlands. The value of the metal was not intrinsic, it was relational. It worked because other systems, not yet collapsed, still honored it. Gold was not a store of value. It was an exit from a system that had stopped storing value. This is a critical difference. Gold did not survive the collapse of the mark. It survived outside it. Tools and machinery survived, but only the kind that produced essentials. A printing press was valuable. A lathe was valuable. A loom was valuable. These were not investments. They were nodes of production in a world where production had become the only claim that mattered. To own a machine that made bread, or clothing, or shelter, was to own something that could not be inflated away. But to own a machine that made luxuries, or that required complex supply chains to operate, was to own a relic. The collapse sorted tools into two categories: those that worked in a simplified economy, and those that required the full edifice of the old economy to function. Most fell into the second category. Human skills survived, but again, only specific kinds. A carpenter could trade labor for food. A doctor could trade care for safety. A translator could broker exchanges between linguistic groups. These were not professions that required credential verification or institutional support. They were capabilities with immediate, legible outcomes. The value of skill was no longer mediated by diplomas or professional associations. It was mediated by whether someone needed what you could do right now. The old hierarchies of expertise collapsed. The surgeon and the seamstress were suddenly adjacent in worth because both did things that mattered in a world stripped of abstraction. Social networks survived, perhaps most powerfully, not networks in the professional sense, but webs of mutual obligation. A family with cousins in the countryside could eat. A worker with connections in the black market could heat his home. These networks had always existed, but they had been secondary to formal economic structures. When the formal structures failed, the informal ones did not replace them so much as reveal that they had been load-bearing all along. The person who survived was not the one with the most assets on paper, but the one who could call in favors, who had built reciprocity when times were stable, who was embedded in a mesh of human obligation that did not depend on currency or contract. But here is the pattern beneath the pattern. Every asset that survived did so because it answered a very specific question. What can I do with this tomorrow? Not next year. Not when things stabilize. Tomorrow. The assets that went to zero were the ones that required a functioning future to have value. Bonds required a stable government. Stocks required enforceable contracts. Currency required collective belief. Deposits required trust in institutions. These were all bets on the continuity of a system. When the system broke, the bets did not pay out because there was no longer a house to settle them. The assets that survived were not bets. They were facts. Food is a fact. Shelter is a fact. A tool that works is a fact. A skill that produces something needed is a fact. A relationship based on reciprocity is a fact. These things did not require the broader system to validate them. They validated themselves through use. This changes the question of what an asset is. We think of assets as things that hold value over time, but in a collapse, time itself becomes unstable. The future stops being a reliable extension of the present. Planning ceases to function. The asset that holds value over time is useless in a world where time has stopped meaning what it meant. The relevant question becomes, what is this worth in the next transaction? And the only things worth anything in the next transaction are things that the other party can use immediately or convert immediately into something they can use. This is why liquidity in the traditional sense fails. Liquidity assumes a market. It assumes price discovery. It assumes that there is a bid somewhere for what you are selling. In a collapse, markets do not freeze because no one wants to buy. They freeze because no one knows what anything is worth. The price of bread in the morning is not the price of bread in the afternoon. The price of bread in marks is not the price of bread in dollars. The price of bread from a stranger is not the price of bread from a neighbor. Every transaction becomes a negotiation in a fog. The liquid asset is the one that requires the least negotiation, the least translation, the least trust, which means it is almost never financial. Now consider the second collapse, because the pattern repeats with variation. The Soviet Union in 1991 did not hyperinflate. It disintegrated. The ruble lost value, but slowly, then all at once. The real collapse was institutional. The apparatus that guaranteed property rights, enforced contracts, regulated commerce, vanished. Not everywhere, not permanently, but enough that the formal economy stopped being the primary economy. What went to zero this time was different in kind but identical in structure. State enterprises, which had been the backbone of Soviet economic life, became worthless overnight. The factories still stood. The workers still knew their jobs. But the distribution networks that moved raw materials in and finished goods out had been centrally planned, and the center had stopped planning. A factory that made tractor parts was worth nothing if the tractor factory had no steel. The asset was real. The system that made it valuable was not. Ownership meant nothing. Production meant nothing. The enterprise was a building full of expensive equipment that could not produce anything anyone could buy. Pensions vanished. Not formally. The state continued to issue pension payments, but the payments bought less each month, and the services pensions were meant to purchase, healthcare, housing, food security, were no longer guaranteed by the state. The implicit contract that decades of labor entitled you to security was revealed to have been contingent on a state that could enforce it. When the state could not, the pension became a symbolic gesture. You received it. It did not sustain you. Savings, again, were erased, but this time, not by inflation alone. Banks failed. State savings institutions closed. Accounts were frozen, then unfrozen, then redominated. The money you had put away was technically still there, but accessing it required navigating a bureaucracy that was itself collapsing. By the time you could withdraw, the value had leaked away. The savings existed in a legal sense, but not in any practical sense. The number in the ledger was unchanged. The world it referred to had been replaced. What survived this time was almost identical to what survived Weimar, with one addition. Apartments survived, but only if you lived in them. Ownership was murky, contested, dependent on documents that might or might not be honored. But possession was clear. If you were in an apartment, you could stay in the apartment. The state was not evicting anyone. The legal structure to evict had broken down. Physical presence became a form of ownership that trumped title. This was not property in the legal sense. It was control. And control, in the absence of enforcement, was worth more than title. Bartered goods survived. Cigarettes became currency. Vodka became currency. Anything portable, divisible, and universally desired could function as money better than money. The ruble was still legal tender. The ruble was also increasingly ignored. Transactions happened in goods, directly, without monetary mediation. The economy did not stop. It reverted. It became a network of bilateral exchanges, governed not by price, but by negotiation. The person with a stockpile of cigarettes was wealthier than the person with a bank account. This was not because cigarettes were inherently valuable, it was because they were liquid in the only market that mattered, the informal one. Access survived. Not credentials, but access. If you knew someone who worked in a distribution center, you could get goods. If you knew someone in the municipal housing office, you could get an apartment. If you knew someone in the police, you could get protection. These were not formal assets. You could not put them on a balance sheet, but they determined who ate and who did not, who was safe and who was not. The social capital that had been secondary in the Soviet system became primary. The formal economy had rationed access through bureaucracy. When the bureaucracy collapsed, access was rationed through networks. The networks had always existed. Now, they were everything. The pattern is stable across collapses. What goes to zero is anything that depends on a complex system remaining functional. What survives is what works in a simpler system, or what allows you to exit the system entirely. This raises a question we do not ask often enough. If the assets we are told to accumulate are the ones most vulnerable to systemic collapse, what are we actually accumulating? We are not accumulating safety. We are accumulating exposure. Every financial asset is a claim on a future system. If the system persists, the claim pays out. If the system bends, the claim becomes conditional. If the system breaks, the claim becomes decorative. We call this diversification, but it is not diversification across outcomes. It is diversification across categories within a single outcome, the outcome where the system continues. True diversification would mean holding things that work when the system does not. But most of us do not do this because the things that work when the system does not are inconvenient when the system does. A pantry of food is not liquid. Land that you work is not passive income. A skill that produces essentials is not scalable. A network of reciprocal obligation is not portable. These assets have costs. They require attention, labor, maintenance, presence. The financial asset is appealing precisely because it requires none of these things. You buy it and forget it. It appreciates while you sleep. This is the fantasy. It is also the fragility. The collapses teach us that value is not inherent. It is contextual. A bond has value in a world where governments can be trusted to repay in money that holds its worth. A stock has value in a world where contracts are enforced and profits can be repatriated. A bank deposit has value in a world where banks remain solvent and withdrawals remain possible. Remove the world and the value relocates. It does not disappear. It moves into things that do not require the world to be what it was. We are living now in the long, soft assumption that the world will remain what it is. The financial system will function. Contracts will be honored. Institutions will persist. This is not irrational. It is the bet that has paid out for most people in most developed economies for most of the last 70 years. But it is still a bet. And the structure of the bet is identical to the bets that failed in Weimar, in the Soviet collapse. In every systemic rupture we study, but do not internalize. The person who survived those collapses did not survive because they predicted them. They survived because they held things that did not require prediction. A farmer with food does not need to know whether the currency will hold. A craftsman with tools does not need to know whether the banks will open. A person embedded in a community does not need to know whether the state will provide. These are not positions of wealth. They are positions of independence from the question. And here is what we are not telling ourselves. The distance between a functioning system and a non-functioning system is not gradual. It is not a slope. It is a threshold. The system works until it does not. The currency holds value until it does not. The institution honors its obligations until it does not. There is no intermediate state that lasts. There is no soft landing. The collapse, when it comes, is binary, and the assets that depend on the system being on one side of that threshold all fail in the same moment for the same reason. You cannot diversify away from a threshold by holding different things on the same side of it.